Yep, you're good, Janice.
Okay, perfect.
So if you guys are all set, we'll get started. So welcome to Pharmacy Grand Round. Today we have the pharmacy residents presenting their research project. So it's an intro of what they'll be working on for the next year. So we'll start in Moncton where we have three of our residents. So Courtney, Rachel, and Carol Ann. And then we'll come to St. John where Jessie will present on her project. So each resident will have about 7 minutes to present on the project, and then there'll be time for questions at the end of their presentation. So I'll hand it over to you, Courtney.
All right, so my name's Courtney. I'm one of the residents in St. John, even though I am in Moncton right now. And like Heather mentioned, this is just a brief overview of my project for the year. So minimal detail, but feel free to ask questions if there's anything that's standing out. So my project is called A Cross-Sectional Analysis of Burnout Among Hospital Pharmacists in Canada. And generally for this presentation, I'll walk you through the outline. I'm sure it'll be similar for the other ones going forward, but we'll touch on the background, the purpose of the project, what the research question actually is, the methodology, the outcomes we're looking at, the primary hypothesis, and how we plan to implement this in terms of knowledge translation, and then just a brief note of where I am right now with my project. So this project is on burnout, and in terms of defining burnout, it's defined as a syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment that can occur among individuals that do people work of some kind. So not specific to the healthcare field at all, but can be applied in this setting as well. So burnout can occur through two mechanisms. So the first one is demanding jobs that cause exhaustion, and the second is insufficient resources to meet the demands of your job. So with pharmacists expanding scope and certainly issues like drug shortages and staff shortages, you can see how these mechanisms could apply to pharmacists as well. So in terms of what we know about burnout right now, there has been quite a bit of research exploring this concept in other healthcare providers, so nurses, physicians, and there is some research in terms of pharmacists as well. So there are three main studies that we've come across. So in the US, they've done a study, Australia and Japan as well, but we have no Canadian literature at this point to explore the landscape in Canada. And from these studies, we can see that the percentage of hospital pharmacists that do experience burnout is up to 61.2%. So that is quite significant. As well with these studies, they've explored some precipitating factors, but they haven't been well defined. So here's a list of some of them that have been explored in the literature and are associated. So age, gender, years practicing as a pharmacist, marital status, inadequate administrative time and teaching time, too many non-clinical duties, difficult colleagues, and feeling that one's contributions are underappreciated. So in terms of the impact of burnout, what we know right now is that it has been associated with negative outcomes. So from these studies and studies from other healthcare providers as well, we've seen decreased quality of patient care. So burnout within pharmacists can really have an impact on the patient as well. There's been an increase in medication errors and also increased anticipated job turnover. So difficult retention with employees that are experiencing burnout. And burnout can be measured through a couple different tools. So I've listed the three main ones here that we did explore when drafting the protocol. We decided to go with the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is the gold standard in the literature when assessing burnout. It does offer different versions of the scale. So there is one that is specific to healthcare providers. So that's a nice feature for this study as well. Unfortunately, it does cost though, where the others are free, but on a positive note, we have secured some funding to use this tool going forward. So these are a list of my co-investigators. So we're a quite large research team. So Corey, Heather, Megan McKenzie from NSHA, Sarah Burgess as well from NSHA, Stacy here in Moncton, and Andrew in St. John from Research Services, and then Odette Gould as well from Mount A. So why we're doing this project overall, we're looking to add to the literature of burnout to specifically focus on that Canadian landscape where it hasn't been explored. And we'd also like to extend the current research to further identify precipitating factors that are associated with burnout. So our research questions are: what is the prevalence of burnout among Canadian hospital pharmacists, and what precipitating factors are associated with burnout in this population? So to address these two questions, we'll be doing a cross-sectional cohort survey. And this will be administered through two avenues. So the first one is through CSHP's QID platform. So through all the various PSNs, we'll be issuing an invitation and then following up with reminders as well. And the CSHP interaction newsletter. So there will be two newsletters issued throughout the survey. One will be the initial invitation, and then one is a reminder as well. And the survey itself can be divided into 4 parts. So we're looking at demographic data, employment characteristics. There will be a single open-ended question to capture any additional factors that could be associated with burnout, and then the MASLAC burnout inventory itself to quantify burnout and identify the prevalence of burnout. So with this, our 2 outcomes would be the prevalence of burnout, which will be measured with frequencies and percentages calculated from the MBI. And the secondary is to identify those precipitating factors. So depending on what the variable is and how it can be quantified, we'll be using a variety of tests. So chi-squared, t-test, and a hierarchical multiple logistic regression. So we think that burnout will likely be high among Canadian pharmacists as seen in other studies. So what we plan to do with this information, so poster presentations, we'd really like to pursue publication, and that's another reason why we went ahead with using the MBI. Because it is the gold standard, we felt that it would assist in this department. Share information with pharmacy leaders. So if there are areas that have been identified to be associated with burnout more frequently, perhaps trying to mimic positions that do not have those qualities and finding a balance so that pharmacists can work without experiencing that burnout, and any additional opportunities that arise. So we'd be happy to share this information if anyone has any other suggestions as well. So project status, I did finalize the protocol and survey, and it was submitted last week to HRPP. So right now we're in the process of preparing the survey on REDCap, which is the database that will be used to build and house the survey. And then by the end of this week, we should be going ahead with a pilot. We're piloting against some retired hospital pharmacists just to make sure that it is inclusive for all factors that could be associated with burnout, and to address how long the survey will take as well. Any questions or comments?
You said that it was just going to CSHP members, the questionnaire, the survey?
So it'll be administered through QID. So just based on our sample size calculation, that was the easiest way to determine what the population was, those who were members of CSHP. So that's how we based our calculations off of. So it will go to CSHP's QID platform and also their newsletter that they issue as well.
Sorry, is the intent to then share it, or is it just going to be targeted so it goes to, I get into my inbox, do I then share it? I'll give up my site to then go ahead, or do I answer alone?
Just answer alone. So whoever has access to that link would be answering the survey.
So do we have a proportion of hospital pharmacists that are non-members of CSHP? Would that reflect their outcome somehow?
I did contact CSHP to try and find a way that we could quantify the numbers of how many pharmacists there are. But the only data that they could supply me with was the number of members per province. So unfortunately, that's what we did have to use to calculate.
The society or the association should be able to tell you how many hospital pharmacists in the province.
But the issue with those is we wouldn't know how we would reach them if they're not through the CSHP platforms.
If they're in Brunswick and they're in Horizon or Calité, email. Anyway, I understand what you're trying to do.
Confidentiality is
Yeah.
people sign things off and don't say, okay.
It's not that easy.
It's not easy anymore to, like in the past, we've done this, and you've sent an email to almost every hospital director, and that's labor intensive, but they're cutting down a lot of spam. So that is the issue. Now, if you go through CSHP, you're get CSHP members, that's a disadvantage, but I don't know, there's,
Yeah,
this is CSHP's recommended way. So in the last few years, they've seen an increase in their surveys come out. So they really worked on saying this is your way that you're doing it, so that it's not bombarding everybody. But I understand you're going to miss some people that are not CSHP members.
and that's okay if that's considered in your discussion. And that's the other piece that I would say that you're sending it just to the QIP. You may be targeting a certain group of CSHP members. Highly active, highly engaged, those people.
Yes.
So just, again, something to be aware of, right?
Or what about people that are like, they're not CSHP members, but they're Catholic.
That's what I was going to
Yeah. But again, I think one of the things we have hopes that they're to their own members, and like,
I said on the research maybe. So that's
So
not.
like,
It just has to be submitted by a member.
Yeah.
Not a member. Yeah.
previous years we've done. I don't know, I have to double check that, I think that I got a legal last year. Yeah, so I have to double check that.
Basically, a lot of it is that they want to go through their RDP as well, to have their say, which is not.
Glenn, you had a question?
What's the difference between a survey and a cross-sectional cohort survey? I just have no idea. I've never heard of them.
That is a great question. I actually do not have an answer for that at this point in time, but I can certainly look into that and give you a response. Any other questions? Any questions from other sites? All right.
No questions from St. John, but just a comment as the other two Moncton residents present. It's a little bit hard to hear the non-presenters when they ask questions, so if you guys don't mind just giving a quick summary or repeating the question so all sites can hear.
Sure.
Thank you.
Heather. Are you going next, Rachel or Caroline?
So hi everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Rachel Cormier. I'm one of the pharmacy residents here at the Moncton Hospital. So my research project that I'll give a brief overview of is called a Point Prevalence Survey of Antimicrobial Usage in New Brunswick Hospitals. So here's a list of my co-investigators. So it includes Tim, the infectious disease pharmacist here at the Moncton Hospital, Rachel Harris from the St. John Regional Hospital, Dan Landry, the infectious disease pharmacist at Vitalite Health Network, and Andrew Llewellyn from Research Services in St. John. So here's just a brief outline of what we're going to go over in the presentation. So we're going to talk a bit about the background and the purpose of the project, our primary and secondary objectives, our methodology, hypothesis, and knowledge translation, so what we're going to do with the results of the project, and the current status of the project. So why is this an important research topic? So this is a recent projection made by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which states that by 2050, drug-resistant infections are predicted to lead to an estimated 2.4 million excess deaths in developed countries alone. So this includes countries like Canada, Australia, the UK, the US, and the statement basically highlights the seriousness of antibiotic resistance as a healthcare threat to Canadians and the magnitude of the clinical issue currently. So there exists a large requirement of healthcare professionals to address this issue, especially as pharmacists, as we're often frontline when it comes to the prescribing of antimicrobials. So the purpose of this research project is to establish the current patterns of antimicrobial usage and appropriateness within New Brunswick hospitals, and to also identify opportunities that exist to improve patient outcomes and safety through targeted antimicrobial stewardship initiatives. So just some background on the project itself and previous research that has been done. So antimicrobial resistance is currently on the rise, both globally and nationally. So there's an increasing need to strengthen antimicrobial stewardship practice in order to optimize antimicrobial prescribing. In order to inform antimicrobial stewardship practices locally, it becomes essential to identify provincial patterns of antimicrobial utilization. So in order to do that, prevalence surveys have been shown to be a useful tool, and there has been several that have been completed in New Brunswick to date, back in 2012 and also in 2018. However, these tools used previously lack a broad assessment of antimicrobial appropriateness, as over 50% of antimicrobial prescriptions that were assessed could not be accessory because of lack of a applicable guideline, and therefore currently we have an incomplete picture of antimicrobial appropriateness, and therefore there's currently a gap in our knowledge. So this is where hospital NAPS comes into play. So NAPS stands for National Antimicrobial Prescribing Survey. So this was a tool developed in Australia to assist the auditing of antimicrobial prescribing practices in healthcare facilities, and it's now available for use in Canada. So it has been piloted within New Brunswick already, within Horizon and Vitalite Health Networks. And it's different in that it facilitates a broader assessment of antimicrobial appropriateness than any tool that's been used previously, like Global PPS. And it assesses antimicrobial appropriateness separately from assessment of guideline compliance. So basically, we can assess antimicrobial prescriptions that don't have a corresponding guideline that go with them. Therefore, that brings us to our objectives of the project. So our primary objective is to assess the patterns of antimicrobial utilization and appropriateness, to establish a baseline benchmark, and to tailor future antimicrobial interventions. And our secondary objective is to assess the impact of hospital type, so that being referral versus non-referral centers, and penicillin allergy on antimicrobial appropriateness. So in terms of our methodology and study design, we're using a hospital-wide point prevalence survey. And so that basically gives us a screenshot in time of antimicrobial prescribing within the province, and it is a prospective chart review. So in terms of hospitals that are participating with the survey. We have 10 participating sites in total, 5 from Horizon Health Network and 5 from Vitalité Health Network. And we plan to include patients that are on one or more systemic antimicrobial at the time of the survey. So based on the fact that approximately 25% of patients in a hospital are on antimicrobial at one time, and based on the size of each of our hospitals participating in the survey, our estimated sample size is approximately 560 patients. So we have launched the survey this month. So we've started data collection. Data collection has started at the St. John site already. It has been completed in Fredericton, I believe, and it's to start in Moncton in a few weeks. And it's also started within Vitalité. So we'll be using the structured protocol and web-based data collection form from Australia, which is NAPS. And this includes an assessment of guideline compliance and appropriateness. And an independent second check will be completed on each antimicrobial appropriateness assessment by a different data collector. In terms of data analysis, we'll use descriptive statistics. So for continuous variables like patient age, antimicrobial dose, and frequency, for example. And we'll be using a 2x2 chi-square test to assess the impact of a presence or absence of an antimicrobial, presence or absence of a penicillin allergy, and hospital size on appropriateness using that test, the chi-square test, and we'll be using Cohen's kappa coefficient, which will assess the variability in the assessment between the different surveyors. So based on previous studies, we hypothesized that the approximate usage of systemic antimicrobials will be appropriate usage, of systemic antimicrobials will be less than 70% across New Brunswick hospitals. And we also hypothesized that antimicrobial appropriateness will be lower in patients with a penicillin allergy label and lower in patients in non-referral centers, so the smaller rural sites versus our larger referral centers. So in terms of knowledge translation, we plan to communicate the results of the point prevalence survey by presentation at the end of the residency year, as well as the potential for a publication. The impact we hope to have with the results of the NAP survey is to be used to determine the focus of future antimicrobial stewardship interventions within NB hospitals. The results will also establish a baseline benchmark that we can that can be used to measure the impact of broad-based interventions as well as locally focused interventions. And then once we apply a stewardship intervention, then we can then see the impact of it by repeating the audits or the point prevalence surveys. So our project status, or the protocol and the REB has already been submitted and approved back in September, and now we're in the process of data collection. So like I said, it's started at many sites and actually has been finished at one of our sites, and we hope to start data collection here in Moncton within the next couple of weeks. Any questions from anyone?
I anticipate having a difficult time to get the 560 that you need, or the one site that's finished, how many patients, they got, or?
I actually don't know. I think they just finished today, Jim said. Total patients? Sorry, so the question was how many patients did... Oh, sorry.
Do you think we're going to have trouble to get 560 patients?
It's do we think we're going to have trouble getting to 560 patients? I'm not really sure. Just based on previous data, like I said, 25% of patients approximately are on antibiotic at any one time within the hospital. So if we calculate our total amount of beds in each hospital and times that by a quarter, it came out to around 560 patients. So.
Hey, Rachel.
Yeah.
It's Glenn in Fredericton.
Oh,
We
hi.
had 75 patients, I believe, in total, and
Okay.
that's out of 314 beds. So that's roughly your what you're looking for. So if we do that same percentage at each site, I think you'll be good.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the other side? Okay, perfect. If anyone thinks of anything, you can send me an email.
That's okay. All right, so my name's Carol Ann, as most of you here in Moncton know, and then for the St. John Group. And my project is called the Evaluation and Clinical Impact of Pharmacist-Led Interdisciplinary Service, focusing on education, monitoring, and toxicity management of immune checkpoint inhibitors. So I have the same outline as the previous two presentations. In terms of co-investigators, the first person is Glenn Myers. He's here in Moncton at the Oncology Clinic. Jonathan Stevens in St. John, and then Andrew Flewelling, who's in Research Services, again in St. John. Providing a little bit of information in terms of background, oncology pharmacists have been working as a part of the interdisciplinary team for several years and have made valuable contributions to patient care as part of many clinical oncology services, so mostly oral anti-cancer, clinic, stem cell transplant, inpatient oncology, etc. And usually doing so by supporting patients through education, excuse me, toxicity management, as well as supportive care strategies, as well as helping in terms of drug funding challenges. So in terms of actual immune checkpoint inhibitors in my project, they are monoclonal antibodies designed to antagonize receptors, also known as immune checkpoints, which are located on activated cytotoxic B cell or cancer cells. So specifically, we'd be looking at the CTLA4, the PD-1, and PD-L1. For immunotherapy, it's unique from conventional cancer treatment in terms of mechanism of action, administration, adverse events, how we monitor, and toxicity management. So in your classic anti-cancer toxicities, we'd be looking at things like drug-induced diarrhea, whereas with immunotherapy, we're looking at a more autoimmune type toxicity, so it's treated slightly differently. As of now, currently there are very many studies looking at how pharmacists can be involved in toxicity management or in hospitals specifically, but looking at immunotherapy, there are only a couple studies, so we wanted to kind of broaden the information that is there and help with the research in terms of hospital pharmacists as well. So in terms of the reasons that I chose this project, I have a passion and interest in oncology, so I wanted to do a project that would look into this field. I also have an interest in showing benefit of pharmacists in the interdisciplinary team. So again, this project helped in doing, or will help in doing that. There's a gap in the available research. So like I mentioned, there are only a couple studies that actually look at immunotherapy and hospital pharmacist benefit managing these. And then this study might help in terms of resource allocation and applicability in other areas. So specifically in terms of the research question, we're looking at, does having an oncology pharmacist involved in the interdisciplinary outpatient oncology team have a clinical impact, allowing for earlier identification and appropriate management of these IRAEs, or immune-related adverse events? And then secondarily, we're looking at, does the oncology pharmacist involved in early identification and management of IRAEs improve specific clinical outcomes for patients? So in terms of study design, it'll be a retrospective chart review as well as a matched cohort study. So most of you probably know information about chart reviews, but a matched cohort study is basically looking at two different populations that have slightly different interventions and seeing if which area does better. So basically we'll be matching a patient from Moncton to a patient in St. John who doesn't have an oncology pharmacist looking at toxicity management and monitoring and trying to compare clinical outcomes for these patient groups. So I kind of alluded to this, but there will be two cohorts of patients who have been receiving ICIs between January 1st, 2016 and August 31st, 2019. And again, like I said, that'll be from the Moncton Hospital Oncology Clinic and St. John Regional. The patients will be matched in the second part based on ICI regimen, so which medication did they get, the type of cancer that they have, and their age, based plus or minus 5 years. In terms of procedure, we'll be using a few different platforms. So IntelliDose will be where we'll get patient information such as age, gender, which treatment they're on, what type of cancer they have. And that'll also be taken out of Meditech here in Moncton, as well as the number of cycles or duration on therapy. And then again, excuse me, for the first part, Meditech will be used for interventions done by the pharmacist here in Moncton. And then the electronic health record will be where we get most of those clinical patient outcomes, which I'll outline on the next slides. For patient information and identifying which patients have been on ICIs, in St. John, we'll be using the Allscript system. So this is a busy slide, but this is basically the first part where we'll only be doing this in Moncton, and it's actually identifying the interventions done by the pharmacist. We're only doing this in Moncton because, as I mentioned, in St. John, there isn't somebody currently doing these interventions. So looking at number of referrals to other healthcare providers by the pharmacist, number of systemic immunosuppression recommendations, so things like corticosteroids, looking at the dosage, duration, choices of therapy. We'll also be looking at a number of immunosuppression supportive care recommendations. So that would be things like if a patient is getting steroids and is also diabetic, so looking at if we recommended anything in that setting. Number of non-systemic immunosuppression treatment. So again, things like topical treatments versus the more systemic treatments. The number of other medication additions or adjustments. So again, this would be like starting Synthroid for a patient that might be having a thyroiditis. Number of general supportive care recommendations not deemed to be an IRAE. So this would be things like pain management. Number of education sessions provided. So again, counting how many times the pharmacist might have provided education, usually at the beginning of treatment. Number of biochemical monitoring recommendations. So this would be things like recommending a TSH level. And then number of non-pharmacologic recommendations. So things like moisturizers if a patient is experiencing a rash. And then the last is other. So that's all encompassing in terms of interventions that don't fit in to the other criteria. In terms of part 2, this is where we'll be comparing using the matched cohort style, so comparing clinical outcomes with Moncton to St. John. So this will include number of total emergency department visits, number of emergency department visits that would be related to the IRAEs, number of hospitalizations, number of ICI treatment delays, ICI treatment discontinuation due to toxicities, and total duration on therapy. So the objectives or outcomes of the study will be to determine the number and types of interventions performed. So again, that'll be specifically in Moncton, and then evaluating the clinically relevant patient outcomes. So that'll be comparing the two sites. In terms of hypotheses, we would like to see that pharmacists following patients receiving the ICIs would lead to less treatment discontinuation, timely initiation of immunosuppression if they are experiencing an IRAE, fewer emergency department visits, fewer hospitalizations due to toxicities, as well as longer duration of treatment. For knowledge translation, we intend to publish a manuscript, hopefully, in either the Journal of Pharmacy Practice or of Oncology Pharmacy Practice. And we'd also like to see presentations of the results at either of the major oncology pharmacy conferences that I put up on that slide, as well as potentially others. And then in terms of potential impact, we look to fill the gap, which I already mentioned, potentially help in terms of resource allocation, and hopefully see an impact for future research. In terms of project status, we've already done the background and literature search. We've established a study design and protocols, and submitted and had approval from REB. And at this point, we'll be starting data collection hopefully within the next few weeks, and then that will lead to data analysis and the writing of the project or the manuscript. So does anybody have any questions? Here in Moncton, or?
You mentioned you're looking at age, gender, number of cycles.
Yep.
Would performance status have any play in there? You think? Like when they come in with an adverse-related effect, or would that make it different anywhere along?
Just to repeat the question for the other sites, the question had to do with including performance status as one of the factors that we would look at. Other studies that we looked into did sometimes mention the ECOG status or performance status. However, we decided not to include it in our actual matching, just because the more that you put into that match cohort style, it's not a decreased efficacy or decreased study results, but it just seems to inhibit actually being able to match the patient specifically. So we didn't actually include that. But yeah, thank you for the question.
The other thing I was going to say, so on your introduction in an oncology pharmacist, like I wonder if somebody, like we know that's what we term ourselves, all whatever, working in oncology, but I'm kind of wondering if there's another term that use for that, or like I'm just thinking if it gets published in an international journal, is that what everybody calls a pharmacist that works in oncology, an oncology pharmacist, or you know, I'm just kind of thinking.
Well, if it's published in a journal of oncology pharmacy practice,
Okay.
I would think that.
Okay.
So just to repeat the question.
Let's use the word pharmacist.
Just to repeat the question, it had to do with using the term oncology pharmacist versus pharmacist, or using a different term. Depending on the studies that we were looking at, so I looked at studies that were just hospital pharmacist benefit in general, so different study areas not specific to oncology, as well as those that were. And a lot of the ones that had to do with oncology did refer to the pharmacist as an oncology pharmacist. Others just referred as the pharmacist. So I think they're interchangeable. Yeah.
The only caveat that I would say to that, I don't think you can worry necessarily that the department will be by an oncology pharmacist.
Right.
But where there is an actual board certification specialty of oncology pharmacist.
Right.
Again, presentations around here, you're probably fine by just using that, but if you're looking at an international journal, there might be some confusion in that pharmacists that we're talking about are not board certified.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely look into if there's specific terminology that is reflected by, like, you mean the BCOG?
Yeah.
Or, yeah. So I'll look into if they have specifics there. Yeah. Sure, Corey?
Are you able to capture if there were interventions made in John? So if you're assuming that there was no interventions because there's no formal program,
Right.
But you know, there's going to be some interventions that are going to get made on one way or another.
Right. So to repeat the question, Corey just asked if we would be identifying any of the interventions that might be happening in St. John. So from my understanding of the St. John site, there's normally an education session that I believe Jonathan does. I'm not sure how frequently he does it, but he does an education session. But this project would specifically be looking at all of the interventions that the pharmacist does here in Moncton, and then comparing that to a site that doesn't actually have that follow-up, the monitoring, meeting one-on-one with the patient specifically. So a slightly different intervention style. In terms of in the discussion piece, I think that it's relevant to add that in St. John, they do education sessions and clarifying how often. just to identify that. But from my understanding, there are no, there's nothing in terms of toxicity management specifically until after potentially.
And it's already been established from the pharmacist in St. John that that's not their standard of practice.
No, I realized that. I was just more so, you know, if you had an intervention that is outside the group, right? Like just come across.
And it's also been mentioned too that I guess the documentation is the challenge from looking, I guess, looking from the that we're looking at, like we can find that, but looking at the documentation. Not here, we have our documentation template here, but.
How many patients did you, or how many people?
That's a good question. So the question here was regarding the number of patients that we would be needing. So for the match specifically, I think it was about 180 pairs to show the specific power that we chose, which was 80 or 0.8. In terms of the, sorry, I just want to make sure that I say this correctly. We would need 34 pairs for the paired TEEP test, and then 180, which is 360 individuals for the McNemar test. So that just depending on which test we're looking at, we need slightly different pairs. When I did a preliminary search in Moncton specifically, we already had about 200 patients here, and then we assumed that it would be similar in St. John, so we should meet that 180 pairs.
Thank you very much, Carol-Ann. Just keep an eye on the time. We're down to about 10 minutes, so I'm going to hand it over to Jessie just to make sure she has enough time.
Hey, hi, my name's Jessie. I'm in St. John. Can everyone other sites see my slides?
We don't see your slides yet.
Okay, we can try again.
Do I have to press connect here?
The slides should be uploading in a couple of seconds.
Any luck?
No, we don't see it yet.
We can see them okay in Fredericton.
Okay.
If you guys bring up the actual Skype program.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
We got it.
Thank you.
Okay, so my name's Jessie. I am currently one of the residents in St. John, and the title of my project for this year is Canadian Community Pharmacist Management of Solid Organ Transplant Patients, a survey-based characterization of confidence in care roles. Okay, so as far as background for this project goes, since 2008, the number of solid organ transplants performed in Canada has increased by 41%. And when we're talking about solid organ transplants, the most common in Canada are kidney, liver, lung, heart, and as well as pancreas. And for all of these organ grafts, their long-term function depends on strict adherence to an individualized combination of immunosuppressant medication. And those that are most common in Canada that we'll be looking at in this study include tacrolimus, cyclosporin, mycophenolate, azathioprine, sirolimus, and prednisone is commonly used, but we'll be excluding that from the study due to the multitude of other uses right now. So in the literature, pharmacist care of solid organ transplant patients has been shown to improve medication adherence, achievement of target plasma drug levels, graft survival, patient medication knowledge, the identification and management of adverse effects, and treatment-related infectious complications. But this literature has all been shown in patients managed by hospital pharmacists, transplant pharmacists working in hospitalized settings. There's currently no literature on what happens, the role of pharmacists in community. So it's largely been limited to transplant centers and their associated outpatient follow-up clinics, such as here in St. John. And community care has not yet been described in Canada in the literature. So throughout the Maritimes and throughout the rest of Canada, patients receive their immunosuppressant medications in many different ways. So here in New Brunswick, patients can take their prescription for an immunosuppressant medication for their solid organ transplant to any community pharmacy of their choice, and they'll have it filled regularly there. In Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, all patients receive their medications from a centralized hospital pharmacy. It's usually an inpatient pharmacy. So, for example, in Nova Scotia, the Victoria General in Halifax ships these medications out across the province to every patient. And then there's some various other practices across the country, such as in British Columbia, where they have a set number of designated community pharmacies at which you can get your medication. So overall, patients and pharmacists have very different experiences dispensing these medications. But regardless of where they're getting these medications, they're getting their other medications from the community pharmacy. And so as a result, community pharmacists are screening for adverse effects, drug interactions, potentially identifying medication errors, looking at patient adherence, and they may even be managing secondary complications of these medications, such as hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia. So you may have all seen this in July. So this was a warning that came out from Health Canada that resulted in various forms of tacrolimus being switched in community pharmacies inadvertently. So this is one of the recent challenges. Some others, we've had increasing numbers of generics for mycophenolate, which is commonly used in Canada as an antimetabolite. And as well, studies have identified inconsistent drug interaction information for these medications across some various common decision support tools, including Micromanix and Lexi, which are frequently used here in Canada. So the purpose of this study is to characterize the patient care provided by pharmacists to solid organ transplants in Canada and to examine their self-perceived confidence in the area of solid organ transplant. Our research question is, what types of care are Canadian pharmacists providing to solid organ transplants, and do they feel confident in providing this care? So our project team, other than myself, we have Heather Naylor here in St. John. She is the nephrology pharmacy lead. Mia Lozier as well. We have Chris Daly from the NSHA. He's the clinical pharmacy coordinator for the multi-organ transplant program there. And we also have Kristen McKinnon, a former St. John resident who is now working in community. So we have a little bit of a mixed bag of experience, transplant, non-transplant, hospital, and community. The reason I chose this project, interest in renal transplant in general. I had some previous experience working with Chris Daly in Halifax with their inpatients there. And I'm coming from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick. I found it very interesting to learn practices across some different provinces. So the methodology, we're currently designing a survey created to collect pharmacist demographics of the pharmacy in which they work, the confidence in and frequency of selected patient care activities, education they've received and the references they use to provide care, and we're asking some open-ended questions regarding the most common challenges they encounter. The survey's been developed through a couple of different mechanisms. The first, so this is not a validated survey. We weren't able to find anything, unfortunately, that we could use. So we started with adapting questions from a publication from 2017 that reported pharmacists' confidence in managing anticoagulation care. This is from, I believe, Australia. So we're adapting questions from that study. We're looking at patient concerns that were identified in a recent publication in which kidney transplant recipients described their post-transplant primary care and the experiences they had with different providers. So we've asked some questions that were identified from some concerns in that study. And we're also developing it through discussion between just hospital and community pharmacists in general, deciding what kinds of patient care roles we expect people to be doing in the different settings. So we'll be distributing through Lime Survey. We're aiming for the survey to be approximately 15 minutes in length, and it will be open for 4 to 6 weeks in early 2020. So our primary outcomes are to describe demographics, training, and workplace settings of the pharmacist, describe their self-reported competence in the patient care activities we're assessing, and to describe the frequency of provision of the patient care activities that we're assessing. Secondary outcomes will be to describe the resources they use to provide care and to describe if they would like additional education or resources in this area. So our hypotheses are that overall, there'll be a low confidence in performing patient care activities, particularly in areas of expanded scope. This hypothesis has been largely anecdotal by talking to various community pharmacies. With the ranitidine recall, the hospital here, Heather, and the nephrology team have received a lot of questions about appropriate options for something as simple as ranitidine. We've heard from patients that their community pharmacies are often not comfortable giving them something like a flu vaccine. So overall, and then we've seen the Health Canada reports of the different formulations being mixed up. So overall, we're expecting a low confidence. And depending on the area of the country, we're expecting a low frequency of performing these activities, particularly in those areas where these medications are received from the hospital. And we're expecting inconsistent familiarity with specific resources, especially one from Canada, from BC Transplant. We're not sure overall how much that's being used by the community pharmacists. So our knowledge translation plan, so we're expecting to do presentation at pharmacy residency graduation work. We are considering a poster at Transplant Atlantic, which usually happens in Halifax in the fall, and potentially publication. Potential impacts include identifying particular areas of weaknesses for pharmacists in the area of solid organ transplant. We may use the findings to develop an information package for community pharmacists that we can send to them when one of their patients receives a solid organ transplant, and put the potential for further research in this area. So our project status, right now we're focusing on survey development and our data analysis plan. So we're narrowing the list of patient care activities that we'll be assessing, and we're looking at the mechanism that we'll use to assess for correlation between their reported competence and how often they're doing these activities. And the goal is to submit to RUB by the end of December. Oh, any questions?
I have time for maybe one question. Yeah, look, Jesse. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. I'll send out an evaluation this afternoon if you guys don't mind filling it out and providing some feedback for the residents. So thanks very much, and just wanted to give you guys a heads up, probably next Friday, December 6th, we're having just a short presentation about 15-20 minutes long at lunchtime on Vanessa's Law. So keep an eye out for an Outlook invitation coming out for that. Thanks, everyone. Close this.